Thank you so much and welcome to Crosspoint. My name is Jason Musyoka. I invite you to yet another episode where we debate and engage issues that matter to us as a society, particularly issues that have a strong bearing to the question of development. Today I want to focus on the leadership question. I will have a much more acute focus in South Africa, but I will also expand that to deal with questions of leadership around the continent. And of course, when we talk about the question of leadership, this is a very critical one because it has been a mainstay or mainstream debate within our continent for at least half a century. The climax of the debate around leadership in Africa was somewhere around the 1990s. You start to see multi-party democracies emerging in the 1990s, and there's a big debate then around the question of good governance. Previously, again, if you go back to development economics, you see the quite innovative, groundbreaking assessments that push forward and suggest that African countries, they need to modernize their economies, and the way to modernize their economies is if they open up their markets, if they liberalize trade. So there are a lot of those discussions that go on in the late 1970s into the 80s. And then come to the 90s, there is this question of good governance. That's an institutional question, good governance. The basis or the genesis of it was that the development opportunities were really squandered in the 1980s, particularly with a lot of aid pouring into the continent, and with so much efforts and potential that was there, that opportunity was lost. And Ms. Moyo writes an interesting book about dead aid, and her argument is how, in fact, the argument is that it's not just that countries that received, like Zaire and Congo and others, that received a lot of aid that they did not develop. She goes on to argue that, in fact, most of the countries that received so much development aid actually became poorer. And her own native country, Zambia, being one of the examples that she cites in that book or in that argument. So because of those blunders that were made in the 1980s, there was a discourse around good governance in the 1990s on how can we manage resources as Africans in a much more credible way, in a way that is more sustainable and that advances development and delivers public good and modernizes these economies. The good governance discourse was suspect for at least two reasons. One, it was a sort of a savior or redeeming or scapegoating of the blunders that had been made by the donors and the Western countries that had made their policies or imposed their policies into the African economies or African continent. And because of that, the scapegoat was the reason why it hasn't worked was because there was poor leadership. And now we need to see how that leadership can be reformed. So that's the first point, how that debate came. And of course, the second point is that the world was moving towards a much more democratic normalizing or democratic calming, if you like. And Africa was particularly emerging from one-party rules and the non-democratic regimes to democratic regimes. So that was a major shift in terms of development debate. And good governance was inserted into the broader development debate as probably the missing link that if we get governance right, then we will get development right, which we did not in the 1980s. Fast forward, then you have the early 2000s, and you start to see an interesting trend going on. A lot of African countries become democratic or multi-party, and then you have the emergence of high growth era, South Africa being part of that critical growth trajectory of high growth. and several other countries, the power forward with significant GDP growth going on. And then in the late 2000s, you begin to see a sort of a retreating, particularly on the question of political leadership. And you start to see again a much more older leadership that takes power in the continent. And until I think into the 2010s, even the questioning of development leadership or political leadership is almost shelved, and we begin to normalize the kind of older leadership that we saw in the early 1970s and 1980s. The paradox is that Africa remains, by and large, a young continent, young labor force, young population, and there's a whole different debate going on about Africa's demographic dividend. I hope we can catch that in one of our episodes. But with all of that, we still have a major disconnect between the political leadership, which is a much more elderly now. Some leaders that are in their 90s, others even in their 80s, in or governing very young populations. And the challenge with that is that you have this disconnect in terms of the needs of the population, in terms of the aspirations of the population, in terms of the ability to innovate or facilitate innovation of a young population. And that's a missed opportunity. That enduring unsynthesis or disconnect between political leadership that is much more elderly and the young population is a major challenge. Now, I want to talk to then, or link that up with some of how these issues resonate, certainly in South Africa, which is our base, and how the failure of leadership is another missed development opportunity. I think that there is a very clear lack of succession in political leadership across the board, and one can look at the question of the governing party itself as well as the opposition parties. The succession leadership, and South Africa is in that moment of fragmentation of leadership, so that there is no loyalty, there is no succession plan, and there is no succession process that we are seeing as citizens. And because you are not able to see that succession plan and process, it easily becomes a scramble or survival of the fittest. That is a challenge that Africa has faced for the last few decades. Because when you have no succession plan, ultimately it's a matter of who has the most amount of money, the most amount of resources to pour into political campaigns, and that's not always the criteria for who is the best leader, who can govern a young population, modernizing economies. And that disconnect, I think, is one of the points that we have to engage in a much more forceful way than we have. So back to South Africa, I think that with the governing party itself losing power over time, we have seen an era, that transition or overlap of coalitions and opposition parties coming together. They don't really have to share ideology. And this is an era of fragmented ideology where you don't really have a commitment to ideology, but there is also no serious commitment to a particular economic objective. The objective is much more elitist. It is much more homo economicus, which is to focus on what is the material gain for me as an individual. Much more individualized society that is far away from the Ubuntu philosophy, I would argue, and much more focused on material accumulation for the individual. That sort of incentive for economic public good is not really there, which is why the coalitions coming together, no matter how much we've seen them now differ in terms of ideology, we are also seeing them hang on together because of what they get out of it. So this idea of coalition government is also an experiment. It's new in South Africa. It started roughly around 2015-16 during the local government elections when the governing party lost most of the metros. And with that, we saw the birth of coalition governments in South Africa. Now, with that, we've seen that experiment, how it's really gone wrong, not in terms of, for the most part, most of them have really been just in and out of this impeachment conundrum. But the greatest loser has been the citizen, the South African citizen, who needs their basic services delivered. But in the time or period and resources that should be, and commitment that should be devoted to basic services, are really being devoted to the alignments of individual interests and so on. So places, metros like Johannesburg, which I think has been one of the most affected, as well as Tshwane, Pretoria, all of those, Nelson Mandela Bay, we've seen the decline of basic services while the political elites are caught up in this battle of a contest for power. And that, unfortunately, is an opportunity that I think from a leadership point of view, we have really lost. The interesting point to make here is that even with the coalition government, this is an institutional arrangement that needs to work for the masses, for the population. We still, even those who form the coalitions, we don't see succession plans, we don't see focused visionary leadership. So in the final analysis, you really have a number of individuals who have opportunities to take over leadership, but they don't really have the gravitas, the focus, the vision, the commitment, and the ethos, or even the pathos of what leadership should really entail. So the leadership question in South Africa, I think, needs to be engaged in a much more forceful way. That is the question of political leadership. I want to move on to civil society leadership. And if you consider how powerful the civil society in South Africa was in the 1980s, this is the sector that was very critical in producing democracy itself. And you see this particularly with the creation of the mine unions that are very effective in terms of advancing the rights of labor force and in the outer circle of things pushing for democracy in the country. And of course, in the early 2000s, most of us who were students at the time, we will remember how the civil society was so forceful, pushing the government, taking the government to court, forcing the government to ultimately roll out antiretrovirus among HIV citizens, or those who had HIV and AIDS. So with that, it is again indicative, or this exhibited the force and the power of civil society. Now, my argument is that we have seen a decline of civil society leadership in South Africa, and with the part of it, again, there are two parts to it. The first of it, in my view, is that there is a recognition over time that in the final analysis, these civil society leaders are also elitists, and therefore the agenda they advance is not necessarily a very different agenda that the politicians or the capitalists advance. A very interesting, I want to skip this and maybe broaden that circle to the broader African context. Some of the most wealthiest individuals in the continent, and if you look at where the NGOs are located, where the NGO executives live, you will realize that they are among the most privileged, whether it's in terms of their ability to accumulate wealth, or whether we are talking about the question of just their own privileges that they have in those countries. So civil society leadership faces that major problem. Again, there is an interesting work also done by Ferguson in the 1980s, the anti-politics machine and anti-development machine. And I think with that, Ferguson points out to how poverty is a very big business, that there are a lot of people who benefit from poverty. And not necessarily as an intentional process, not because they are criminals who are going to take from the poor, but because of the way the system is arranged and organized. So that if you look at, for example, USAID that has been folded, the number of executives who have been laid off from USAID are massive, a lot of them around the world. And it is in that sense that one could argue that poverty is big business, in the sense that it provides a lot of employment, it provides a lot of resources and access to resources, just that those resources don't ultimately reach the poor. And this might be a subtle version of the trickle-down economics, which is to suggest that as long as there's a program going on around poverty or of the poor that is being rolled out, when you see the figures, they look really good. A lot of money that is spent on the programs themselves. But if you look at how much ultimately ended up to develop livelihoods of villagers or rural populations, they become very limited. There is also another interesting book written by Robert Chambers, and the title of the book is Putting the First Last. And one of his interesting arguments is that the decisions that are made around these development programs, they are made in boardrooms, air-conditioned boardrooms that are far removed from the people themselves who are actually in need of those programs. And so they are designed, they are programmed and finalized in those boardrooms far away from even sub-Saharan African countries. And then ultimately they are brought to the populations and imposed on them. Going back to the 1980s, it is really the same story of policy imposition on African countries. So now that it's only on a programmatic level, it's on a program level, or development programs that are implemented on a local level. So there is not major debate around these issues on a national level, because you really have to have sort of a national sequence, national trend, national pattern for you to engage these kinds of issues in a much more robust way. So this issue of civil society leadership is a major one in South Africa. Therefore, if you look at how that process of civil society leadership has dwindled over time, I think it raises serious concerns. But the second point I wanted to mention about the lack of civil society leadership is the configuration of the political enterprise in South Africa. I do not think that the idea of the state and civil society all together in one sort of coalition is necessarily a good thing. So that question of civil society in coalition with political organizations becomes a problem, because the nature of the civil society leadership is a pressure group, and it's supposed to exert the same pressure that we saw the civil society exerting pressure in South Africa on the apartheid regime itself, or even the post-apartheid regime during the pushback, the back and forth of the early 2000s. So the civil society seems to have lost that space and become really co-opted into the broader mediocrity of advancing government agenda without criticism and without being critical. That's an opportunity lost from civil society point of view. Because of that lack of civil society leadership, what we have seen is also a decline of serious civil engagement around critical issues of race, issues of xenophobia, issues of gender-based violence, issues of skills development, the labor force, employment. We've sort of lost, we seem to have lost the voices that were really critical to alert all of these institutions that are responsible for, whether it's universities, whether it's the government itself, but we seem to have lost that voice. And so the key question is, where is the civil society leadership? Because of that vacuum, naturally, what happens with the retreating of civil society is you have now a runaway debate that is no longer controlled, no longer rational, which is why you have the agenda voices that are being pushed forward by the US government around white genocide in South Africa and internal enclaves in South Africa, AfriForum and others that push forward with this agenda, which civil society has really left the table on that debate. And this is where civil society should have really engaged in a much more forceful way to correct some of these propagandas that go on in South Africa, presenting data-based evidence on why there is no genocide in South Africa, and civic campaigns, civic education, and engagements that are much more rational, guiding public discourse around social issues towards a much more rational sort of direction. But that's missing. And because of the lack of civil society leadership, I argue that we find ourselves where we are now with this question of South African citizens going to other countries now as refugees, purely because there is no civil society leadership, I would argue. If you take that failure of civil society to the migration debate, the same point could be made. It seems to me that the civil society's also lack of engagement on data. If you look at migration, for example, the percentage of migrants, African migrants in particular in South Africa, is very small. It's about somewhere between 2 to 3% of the entire population. And that number is even contested. But the noise and the voices that emerge, whether from Dudula and others, are extremely vocal. There's aspects of legitimacy that these organizations make, which is the fact that there is illegal migration going on in the country. And I think that is a very legitimate debate. There's no country that develops without managing the migration process as it should. And I think, again, that I'll talk to, that is a failure of government leadership as opposed to the civil society. When you look at the managing, so it's not so much to control migration. There's a whole debate around migration that talks about how migration is not a problem to be solved, but an opportunity to be managed. And the government's failure to lead in that front has ended up now with the kind of xenophobia that we see in South Africa. But again, this is where civil society leadership might also come in and perhaps look at ways in which there would be civic education, in which there would be advancing of social cohesion, integration of migrants, looking at questions of crime and all of that, that some of them are associated to non-documented migrants. Those kinds of spaces, the civil society could really engage and address them as they should be. So that's firstly the failure of government. I've indicated how failure of government has led to policy blunders, failure of civil society leadership that has also led to the discourses that have really run amok in South Africa, which I think that all is not lost. They can be brought back on course, but there has to be civil society leadership that they step forward. And then the third category that I want to talk about as I end this episode is on the leadership in the private sector itself. One of the very interesting points to make is that the private sector in South Africa is very quiet around issues of social discourse and development discourse. There are a lot of complaints around what government is doing, what government is not doing. And I think that the leadership in the private sector could step forward and assert their leadership position and jurisdiction in managing capital and ensuring that there are innovations, that there is labor skills development. And with that, I think you are likely to have a much more rounded development process. So at the moment, you have a sort of a mongoloid kind of development where you have some aspects that are advancing, others are not, but it is because there is no leadership consensus, so to speak, in terms of linking up civil society, government leadership, and the private sector leadership. Two other points to make. The first is that for private sector leadership, another interesting point there is the fact that when citizens who are in leadership positions and opportunities complain and become victims, and you hear complaints about what government is doing, what the government is not doing, whether it's electricity, whether it's water, that, in my view, is a relinquishing of patriotism and relinquishing of leadership authority to nobody knows who, to other entities. And that is an opportunity that could be harnessed by private sector leaders who need to realize that the task of governing the country is not a unilateral issue. It's not a question of government. It's a question of leaders. And citizens have the responsibility to engage in civic debates, civic conversations about who is more South African than the other, and all of these kinds of, including the migration debate. That is a task that civic education and citizens should continue to engage. But those should be settled questions as far as the leaders are concerned. So leaders should not really be engaging the same questions that citizens are engaging. That is one, in my view, of the factors that has led to a country where people play victim of government action or government inaction. And I think we need to expand the circle of leadership beyond government to civil society and private sector. And civil society, of course, that would include leadership in the religious fraternity and others, where there is full responsibility on development by leaders across all the sectors. The second point on that is, I know that the national dialogue, which was set up by the president earlier this year, has not really peaked. And part of it is, the irony is that you had a debate about leaders having a dialogue around the issues that are facing the country. One of it, of course, being corruption and other social evils. And then you have some organizations, including the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, that withdrew from the national dialogue because there was allegations of corruption going on within the organizing team of the national dialogue itself. And these are opportunities where leadership across the board in the civil society, in the private sector, have to really push back. But I'm not a big supporter of that national dialogue. I think that this is something that needs to come out organically, where leaders are not necessarily convened to try and deal with these issues, but they take it as a personal matter, as a question of ethics and morality to advance the public good and the interests of the country as a whole. So all this to say that there is a major leadership vacuum in South Africa, and I think that the opportunity is there to, number one, ensure that there is succession of leadership to a younger generation, and that is across all the sectors. But also, secondly, most importantly, it is to find that synergy, that consensus. And thirdly, it is for leaders in every quarter to take responsibility, personal responsibility as patriots, to advance the public good, not just to advance agendas of elitism or capital accumulation, but to look at what impact as a leader you would have on the broader society, even if it will never come back to you as an individual. This is not just a South African problem. This is a much broader problem that we are facing in the continent, where leaders fail to really understand what is the gist, or what is the real task of leadership. So in closing, I would argue that the same debate that we had in the 1990s, we might need to revisit. It seems to me that we have to, not just might, but to revisit this question of good governance, good leadership, and move the continent forward. Thank you so much for joining. This is Jason Musyoka from Crosspoint.